The first question that we're going to tackle right now is who created the heavens and the earth? And where do we find that in the Bible is essentially what we want to do. So if you would, everyone move to Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, and let's read that and see what that says. So Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." So in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. So the question is, who created the heavens and the earth? Well, when we look at Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, it says that, greetings by the way, it says that God created the heavens and the earth. So the heavens that you see above you, the earth, everything that you see right now is created by God. And so the Bible is telling us that who created the heavens and the earth? It was God. Now, the Bible does say that God created everything through Jesus. And so we have to keep that in mind. But to keep it at the most basic and most simplest level, who created the heavens and the earth? God did. Was it the Big Bang Theory? No. Was it some sort of evolutional, slime or some sort of, accidental creation of planets and all of this? No. It's not any of that. And if you look into, science even says that there has to be a cause to everything, because there's, no movement without some sort of cause starting it. And so, in the earth, in the heavens, the creator of the heavens and the earth is God, and that's because of Genesis chapter 1 verse 1. That's the basic first thing we need to get established. The second question is who created the air, the water, the land, the plants, the birds, the fish, and all other animals? Who created that? Who created that? Who created the heavens and the earth? And then who created the air and the water? And where does it say it in the Bible? So if we go to Genesis chapter 1 verse 3, it says that, "Then God said, let there be light. And there was light." So God created the light. Now, when we look at it, light is one of the most important things, because without light, without distance, without all of these things, you cannot have time, because time, matter, space, all together creates time. So we must have all of that. So this is where God created the last part of that, which is light. Verse 4 says, "God saw that the light was good, and God divided the light from the darkness." So that there's a difference between light and darkness. My religion is Arianism. So that's a very good question. I'm not Catholic. I'm not all of that. I believe that that God the Father is God, and that Jesus is His Son. So not. So that, if that should answer your question. Thank you for asking, by the way. Yeah, that's the best question, actually. What's more important, knowing the Bible and knowing all of these things, or having a relationship with God? Well, first and foremost, and my belief is that you have to have a relationship with God. Jesus said, you look in the scriptures to find in life, and life's right in front of you. You know what I mean? It's not about having head knowledge or book knowledge as opposed to having a relationship with God. Because how did these guys get the Bible? How did these guys get the words to write down? How did God lead them to write? It was a relationship first. And so if you look in China, you look in all of these places around the world, you might say, how are they able to have a relationship with God when the Bible is censored, where they're not allowed to have the Bible, where they're not allowed to publicly teach each other and all this other stuff? How are they to have that? And that's by a relationship with God, that they're in prayer and in a relationship with God, trying to seek and find who He is, and from there move on to learning. And even the Spirit of God within you can teach you what you don't already know. So yeah, that's a great question, because you have to have relationship more than you have book knowledge. Because book knowledge, anyone can have book knowledge and not have a relationship. Like the people who Jesus says, you know, get away from me. They said, Lord, Lord, have we not done all these miraculous things for you and everything? And he says, depart from me, you workers of iniquity. He casts them away from himself because all they had was knowledge. They didn't have a relationship with him. And he said, I never knew you. So yeah, you got to have a personal relationship with God as opposed to just book knowledge about God. And the one of the analogies that I use the most is, how are you when you with your spouse or your girlfriend or whoever, if you are with them and read about them and they're sitting right next to you and you're reading about them and you know everything they like and dislike, everything they want and all of their desires and everything that's written down, but you never talk to her, you never spend time with her, you don't do anything with her even though she's in the same room, that's not a relationship. So yeah, you definitely have to have a personal relationship with God to be in relationship with God. So is it a relationship when you're just reading about and not learning about it? I don't know. I don't think so. But who knows what people think. So how you doing, Vanessa? Okay, so verse 4 of Genesis, we're in Genesis chapter 1, verse 4. It says, and God saw that the light was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. So we're learning now that God created light, and that he said that the light and the darkness was going to be divided. So there's a difference between light and darkness. Then verse 5 says, God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So there was evening and there was morning. Something about this, God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Now, there's no sun at this point. There's no stars. There's no earth to have a shadow over. There's no sunrise. There's no sunset. There's none of that. So it's interesting when you see that he says that there was evening and there was morning. So how do you have evening and morning without a sun, without an earth, without any of these things? So what I understand is that evening and morning are not times that happen because of the sun and the moon. The evening is a time that God has appointed. God said this time is evening, this time is morning. And he's calculating that evening and morning has happened, even though the sun and the sunset and morning haven't happened, as far as like the shadow around the earth and all of that. So evening and morning are times that happen regardless of where the sun and the moon are. And in my opinion, the sun and the earth and everything are trying to stay in time with that evening and morning time, that they are told, you must be here at this time, you must be here at that time, and this is evening and this is morning, and when it's evening time you have to be going down on this side, when it's morning time you have to be coming up at this time. So evening and morning are times that are established by God, but they're not, they don't have to have a sun and an earth to happen. They happen regardless. So in verse 5 it says, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So there was evening and there was morning the first day. So we've had the first day, and there was no earth and no sun at this point. Verse 6 says, God said, let there be a dome in the middle of the waters. Let me change this version to the King James version that everybody's got. Makes it lots easier. Okay, so verse 7 says, and God said, verse 6 says, and God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. So waters at this point is, if you read it in verse 3, it says that, in verse 2, it says that there was a deep, and that there was waters in the deep, and that the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Okay, so if you have now he says in verse 6, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. So let's say that there's a empty space, and within that empty space is filled up to the top is water. Let's say that this is a round space. So you have a round body of water, And he's saying, let there be a firmament in the midst of the water. So he's saying, let's make a bubble in the middle of this this bowl of water, essentially. And inside the bowl of water, we're going to make another smaller ball. So we're going to put a bubble in, and inside this bubble is going to be another body of water, or water that's inside of it. So in verse 7 it says, and God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. So now we have a ball of water with a bubble, and inside of that is more water. So in verse 8 it says, and God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. So in these two bubbles, the one bubble inside of the outside bubble of water, the outside part of it, the outside body of water is called the heavens, and the inside bubble is called is not called anything yet, but it is separate. It's not the heavens. And so in verse 9 it says, and God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry ground appear, and it was so. So now we have essentially a bowl of water, a round bowl of water. Inside this round bowl of water is a bubble, and inside of that bubble is water. The outside has been called, God has decided to call this outside body of water heaven. The inside, he's saying, let all of it come together and make dry land appear. And so let me see, what verse am I in? In verse 9 it says, gathered unto one place and let dry land appear, and it was dry land appear, and so now you have the outside body of water, and in the middle now you have dry land in the middle of this thing. So that dry land, as we know, is going to be earth. So verse 10 says, and God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. So there's dry land in the middle of this bubble, or that's not a bubble anymore, it's essentially just a dry land mass with water on it, and on the outside of it is another body of water that's considered water or called water, but it's outer space essentially. So verse 12 says, and the earth brought forth grass, and the herb yielding seed of his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind, and God saw that it was good. So verse 11 says, and let the earth bring forth the grass, the herb yielding seed, the fruit tree yielding fruit. And so what did he do was he made it to where there was plants to grow on this planet that he's just designed. In the midst of the waters, he's designed this planet to have plants growing on it. He essentially just made it to where it's possible for plants to grow out of it. And so we're getting a picture of what God is doing. Verse 13 says, and the evening and the morning were the third day. And then verse 14 says, and God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day and the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. Okay, and let them be for the lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light on the earth, and it was so. And God made the two great lights, the great light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the nights, and he made the stars also. Okay, so what are we getting now? We've got this giant bowl of water. Inside this bowl of water there is a planet now, a dry land and waters, dry land and seas, and we've given it, or God has given it, the ability to have plants grow on it. And then he says, let's make some lights, greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. And so obviously this is going to be the moon and the sun. So he's created the moon and the sun now. The lesser light obviously is a reflection of the light from the sun upon the moon. So he's made the moon on the earth and the sun in its wherever it goes, in this giant place. But where is he placing all of these things? He's placing it in the original outer heavens that he's calling it now. So in what we know of as outer space. And just a moment to take a moment and just say, when you think about outer space and you think about water and you think about what the properties of water are. You can float in water, you can swim in water, you can be suspended in water. Things are different. Things weigh differently. Things look differently. When you're in outer space, they're almost exactly the same. In outer space, you are weightless. You can't breathe there. You know, all the different properties of swimming and things like that fall into play in outer space. And so the outer space has the same kind of properties as water does for us, which is interesting. So the heavens are part of these waters that God had originally created. So that's where he puts the sun and the moon now. Let me make sure I don't go too far here. All right, so in verse 19 it says, in the evening and the morning were the fourth day. Verse 20 says, and God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creatures that hath life, and fowl that may fly the earth in the open firmament of the heavens. And God created whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after their kind, and it was good. So, and God blessed them, said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, the seas, the fowl of the air, multiplying the earth. So, at this point, what did he do? So now we have the outside, the deep is what it's called, the space that's holding water inside of it. Inside this outer space, inside this outer space is the earth, a dry land with waters and seas on it, and the ability to grow plants. And we've seen God create the greater light and the lesser light, which is the sun and the moon. And then we see God bringing forth birds and fish of the sea on the earth. So now we've got some life on there, kind of living. Now that the sun is in existence and can keep the earth warm enough to where we're not going to freeze to death, now we can have life on it. And he decides to put first the fish and the birds. Then it says in verse 25, and God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, the cattle after their kind, every living thing that creepeth upon the earth, that after his kind, and God saw that it was good. Okay, last thing that he makes that we're going to read about right now is the cattle, the giraffes, the lions, anything that lives on earth, that walks, crawls, all of that is being made at this point. So now we have, and I hate trying to do this over and over again, but I want you to understand what we're seeing here is this giant empty space called the deep, filled with water. That's in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. Inside of it, there was a bubble, but it was pulled together and made to be dry land. There were seas on it as well, which we know are the oceans and the rivers and everything else. Then God gave it the ability to have plants on it, but we don't have any sun yet. So in my opinion, the seeds are there in the earth, but not necessarily the plants have grown themselves. Then we have the sun and the moon made. That's going to warm up the earth enough for plants to grow, and after that, for birds to eat the seeds and for the animals of the sea to live, which is the next thing that was created. And then we created but God created the animals to live on the earth. So we have birds, we have creeping things, we have animals that live on the earth, we have animals in the water. Everything except man has been made at this point, and the stars also are the part of the lesser lights that we're speaking of, that were put in the outer space, that water, that vast water. As we know, how big is the universe? It's huge. You can just look and look and look and just see forever, and that's how big this space is where everything exists. So it's amazing. All right. So the next question is, who created man, and where does it say it in the Bible? Who created man and where does it say in the Bible is Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27, which are the next verses in the scripture that we're reading. So here's where it starts to get interesting. Verse 26 says, God said, and we know that Elohim, which is the Hebrew word for God here, means more than one. It's plural. So it's kind of saying God's said. When you see Yeled is a boy in Hebrew. Yeladim is boys. So kind of giving you an understanding, like the I am at the end is what makes the word a plural. Anyhow, so we go into, and God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over everything that creepeth upon the earth. So let us make man. What does us mean? Because in the Hebrew Bibles, in every Bible, it does say us because it does mean us. Most Jewish scholars or whatever are kind of baffled by why it says us here, because they know that there's only one God. So in my understanding, obviously, is that when it says let us make man, it is obviously God the Father, who is the only true God, unbegotten, with his firstborn son, right? The first thing that God did before creating all of these things that we've looked at is he begat a son. The Bible says that Jesus is the firstborn of all creation. Exactly, yeah, let us. That's important, Sandy. And that's what we're saying. Let us make man in our image. So there's God the Father, who is unbegotten. Means he's not created. He does not. No one started him. He's always existed. There's no beginning to him. He's just always been. And then there's the begotten Son. John chapter 1 verse 18 says the only begotten God. And then in Colossians it says that Jesus is the beginning of God's creation, or the beginning of creation of God. And then in Revelations 3:14, I believe, says that Jesus is the beginning of God's creation. So he's the first thing. And obviously Proverbs 8:22 says that God made Jesus at the beginning of all things, before all things. And so when it says let us make man, it's God saying, hey, look, let's make man in our image and our likeness. In other words, to rule over the earth, to rule over everything, and to be in dominion over it like we are, essentially. Jesus is the only one that was made in exactly like God's image and God's form. That's Philippians chapter 2, verse 6. And so that's who's talking here. God the Father is talking to God the Son, who is not a Trinity, but it's just God the Father talking to his Son, who is a born God, who has a beginning, who's not like his Father exactly, about creating man. So verse 27 says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Okay, so that's what we understand about God creating the heavens and the earth and the universe. So what is the universe? Where do we see the Bible talking about the universe being born? Just as a pop quiz, does anybody know? It doesn't actually tell you about it. In verse 2, it says, Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 says, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. So where do we see the that's a good question, Sandy. I'll get to that exactly. No, yeah, it's a good question, Sandy, for sure. Verse 2 says that we don't see where it says that the darkness was upon the face of the deep. Deep means something deep, something that can hold something that's far. And when we're talking about the deep, we're talking about big enough to hold the universe. That's pretty deep. And then it says that the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. The Spirit of God was upon the face of the waters. So this deep that's big enough to hold the universe is filled with something that we can understand only as water. And that is what the universe is. And then within the universe, obviously, God created land. And then after that, he created plants on it, and then fish on it, and then cattle on it. And then he made Adam and Eve. And it was, obviously, the Bible says that all things were created through Jesus. So when they're talking about creating Adam and Eve, it's God the Father talking to the Son about creating man. So the good question is, Sandy, why does it talk about the creation of man twice? That's a very good question. If we go to chapter 2 of Genesis, it starts to go into the into the story about Adam and Eve being created. Again, it's in more detail though. So this is what we're going to look at. So I can explain this to you, Sandy, is Genesis chapter 1 says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Before they made our Bible that we know, they with all these Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 things, they didn't have that before. There was just text. And in my opinion, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was a title of the book. There was no 1:1, there was no Genesis title, it was just this. So when I see this, I'm seeing in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth as a title. And then it goes on to explain how God did this. Okay, so when you get to chapter 2 and it starts going into verse 4 says, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. This is Genesis chapter 2 verse 4. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created in that time that the Lord God made the heavens and the earth and the heavens. And then verse 5 says, and every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew, the Lord God had not caused to rain upon the earth, neither was there a man to till the ground. So in this verse, it's telling you where we're at. There was no plants, there was no rain, and there was no man. So he's saying, let's go back to this point. And he says, but there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. This is very important because you have to think about this, and not very many people know this, so just take this as a golden nugget here. The earth was not watered as far as rain is concerned. Does anybody, can you guess, any of you guys, guess why there is no rain on the earth today? I mean, at this point in the earth's history? Any answer at all? Why you think there's no rain? The reason there's no rain is because the earth is so young that the sun has not been able to heat it up enough to cause evaporation, because you have to have evaporation in the earth before it'll rain. And so you have to have enough evaporation to fill up the atmosphere so that the water can collect in the sky and cause clouds. So that means that however long it takes, it took from, in my opinion, it took from the creation of the earth and the sun and the heating up of the earth to up to the point of where Noah is alive to have the first rain. So before that point, we've just been having evaporation of water from the seas, and it's been going up and it's been collecting, but it never rained. In my opinion, the very first rain that ever happened in Noah's time. And I don't know how many generations that is, but it took that long to collect enough water vapor in the sky to have rain. So over the generations of these people's lives, they didn't see clouds in the sky. It was just blue. There was no clouds. It was all just sun all the time. And eventually, as you get closer to Noah's time, you had more and more collection of clouds for the very first rain. So how did you get water on the earth before that? Well, if you had the sun on the earth at all times without any clouds, you're going to heat up the earth. And you have geysers like in Yellowstone National Park, but you would have them all over because the earth would be generally hotter than it is now. And it would spout out water out of the ground and just kind of blow a mist in the sky, kind of like what we see at Yellowstone National Park. So when you see verse 6 in chapter 2 of Genesis, it says, but there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. And then verse 7 says, and the Lord formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. So Sandy, to answer your question, what we saw in Genesis chapter 1 was a generalized, this is how God created everything. This is the order, generally, this is the order that God created everything. And then when you get to Genesis chapter 2, it's a way more detailed version of what happened. We heard, and God made this, and that's essentially all we heard. When we get closer and find out exactly how God created man, we understand that he took the dust of the earth, that he created him and breathed into him the breath of life. You get more details because we're getting a more magnified view, if you want to use like a microscope kind of analogy, is that he's using a microscope kind of view in Genesis chapter 2 about how things happen. So it's not a new event. I know there's people that believe that there was Adam and Eve, man and woman was created in chapter 1, and then a different kind of man and woman was created in chapter 2, and then they start going into some crazy stuff. But I don't think that's what's happening here. I think chapter 1, you have where Adam and Eve are created, and then chapter 2, you're just getting a zoomed in, more detailed explanation about what happened in Genesis chapter 2. Hopefully that answers your question, Sandy. I'm not sure. So Genesis chapter 2, verse 22 and 23, very important, is how did God create woman? And let's go with so Genesis chapter 22 says, and the rib which the Lord God had taken from man. Oh yeah, well, you know what? In Revelation, Sandy, in Revelations it talks about the angels being a third of the stars, that the dragon had taken a third of the stars and cast them down. And everybody generally agrees that that's when he got a third of the angels of heaven to come with him to his own fall, and which is why he has demons that work with him. So when you see in the first chapter, when it says that God created the stars, at that point, not only was it just, in my opinion, not only is it just stars that are being created there, but the angels are being created at the same time. So angels are created at the same time that stars are created, in my opinion, because of the analogy that's being used in Revelations for stars being angels and vice versa. So I'm using it in both areas. So Genesis chapter 2 verse 22 says, and the rib which the Lord God had taken from man made he a woman and brought her unto the man. And Adam said, this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Okay, so really important is that God, first of all, we need to look at where God took Adam from. God took the earth and he created, I guess, a statue, if nothing better to explain it, and said, I'm going to breathe the breath of life into him, and he became a living soul. And obviously when you look at your skin and you look at your hands really closely and you see the tiny little boxes on your body, it looks like sand. It looks like sand. I mean, if you look at yourself really closely, the skin looks like sand. It looks like earth in some ways. That's where Adam was taken out of. So we know where Adam comes from. He's a living soul now, or living person. And then God takes the rib from Adam's side. Now, I was told, and this is not, you know, this is a good explanation of as to why. People used to say, when I was being taught, why did God not take the bone from somewhere else? Why did he choose the rib? Obviously, there's a reason for it. And the answer is the reason why God decided to take a rib instead of, like, let's say a finger bone or arm bone or something like that, is because the rib is the closest part to the heart of man. It's one of the closest bones to the heart of man, and that it is why God chose the rib, because it is close. It is at his side and it is close to his heart. And some of the people that I knew said that if God had taken it from, let's say, the bottom of the foot, then man would always be stepping on her, or, you know, treating her as something under him. And if he took it from the top of his head, that woman would want to be head over Adam all the time, and, you know, because of where she originated from. So that's the explanation that I was given over as to why on this side. But let me ask you another equally important question that has to do with Jesus and the Father, and that's Eve. When Eve was created, Eve did not exist inside of Adam before she was made. Although he did have a rib, it wasn't Eve. So when God decided to take the rib from Adam and form Eve out of it, she took some of his soul with her to become alive. God fashioned her and everything else, and she became alive. But she's no longer, number one, attached to him still. They're not Siamese. She could leave him if she wants to. She's not stuck as like with him for sure. And the reason I bring that up is because Jesus, when he's born from God, and it's not saying that God's creating a son from God from himself, because you can't take anything away from God to make something else. When Jesus is born, he's born as a separate person, his own identity. And you know that if you are married to someone, everybody's accountable for their own personhood. And, you know, a woman could go off and become a sinner and go to hell, and the husband can go to heaven. There's a possibility there of falling away is what I'm saying, and the other person not having to fall away as well. So when we see God giving birth to Jesus as a son, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's still one with him, because God and Jesus are of the same kind of being, and Adam and Eve are of the same kind of being as well. But it doesn't mean that just because these two are of the same kind that they are necessarily one being. So the same way with the Father and Jesus. Just because they're the same kind of being doesn't mean that they're one and the same. They can be the same kind, and one can be the true God, and the other one can be a subordinate, right, under God. And the same way with Adam and Eve, where she is a helper to Adam, and what he wants and what he's doing, obviously they're going to work together, and we're going to get into that complicated stuff. But obviously there is a order. God the Father is head over Jesus. The husband is head of the wife, but there's not, but they're not the same one and the same. And so when you see Jesus talking about, the Father is greater than me and things like that, we're understanding what we're talking about as far as hierarchy and not being the same. So this is kind of helping us understand why they're not one, because of the example given from Adam and Eve. So any questions about that yet? Anything that you guys don't know or want to ask a question about in this general area or anywhere else? Or we can move on to other things. So just feel free to ask. The next question is, so how did God make the first woman out of the rib? Because God wanted her to be close to his heart. Verse 5, question number 6 is, where did God place Adam? After he created Adam and Eve, where did he place him? And actually, this is where God placed Adam, because Eve wasn't even around at this point. It says, and the Lord planted a garden eastward in Eden, and he put the man whom he had formed eastward in Eden. And out of the ground he made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight, good for food, plants, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. An important thing about this right now is that Adam is by himself. God has created all of these plants to come out. He has brought forth all of the animals for him to see. And he put the tree of the knowledge of good and evil there. Now, Eve doesn't exist at this point. So when Eve does come into existence, which we read already, Adam is the one who has to tell her what God said. God said, don't eat that tree. She says, okay, don't eat that tree. I got it. Adam's been around for a while. He's got foreknowledge. He's slipped a couple of times. He's fallen in holes. He knows where things are. When she comes around, he is naturally going to be her guide and her leader. It's kind of the way God did it. If they were created at the same exact time, I think it would be different. But because Adam is created ahead of time and has some knowledge about a lot of stuff already, by the time Eve comes in, and we don't know how long that time period is, Eve comes in and has to learn from Adam. So God has already given Adam this kind of ahead of, knowing about things ahead of time to help Eve with, and feel, personally responsible to teach her and to help her in that area. So God's very wise in the way he's doing things as far as strategically and chronologically. So what did God command Adam and Eve concerning children? So So let's look at that concerning children. Genesis chapter 1 verse 26 says, and that's where we find the answer to that. What did God say about children? It says, and God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the air, the fish of the sea, and the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the creeping things that creepeth upon the earth. Let's see here. 28. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it and have dominion over them, the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, and everything that moveth upon the earth. So what did God command us to do? Is have children. Be fruitful and multiply. What do you do if you can't have children? Well, lots of women in the Bible praying to God to have children and weren't able to. And obviously people make mistakes, and there's things that happen in your life that, you may not have had children, or you may have been trying to have children. Obviously you have to be married, or you want to do these things. So God says be fruitful and multiply. Wherever, in whatever situation you had your children in, love your children, obviously, and be fruitful and multiply. So he wants us to multiply. What would the devil want you to do if you were not, if he wants you to do everything opposite of what God commands you? God would want you to not have children. I mean, the devil would not want you to have children. The devil wants you to do anything that God commands you to do opposite, even if it's not a big bad sin or not. Whatever he says, let's just do the opposite. So when you hear people saying don't have children, you shouldn't have children, or let's, those people who think that certain individuals shouldn't have children, that's actually against what God says. God wants everyone to have children. And you never know. If you never had children or never wanted children, when you have your first child, I guarantee you'll change your mind. And if not, somebody will take your child for you, that's for sure. Although you should obviously take responsibility for your own. So what did God command us about having children? Have children. It's not, you look at the Catholic Church and they say, priests are not supposed to get married, are not supposed to have, not supposed to have sex and this kind of stuff. That's not in the Bible, honestly. Nuns are supposed to not get married and all of this stuff. That's not biblical. To be a eunuch, or to decide that you don't want to ever get married and you don't ever want to have sex in your life, that's something that a few people get, that God gives them to do. And then there's a few people that can do more and want to have kids for God and stuff. So to be someone who wants to be celibate for the rest of your life is not necessarily required to be a Christian, but God did say somebody's got to have children around here. So God does want us to have children. There's nothing wrong with having children. There's nothing wrong with having sex. Obviously you want to be married to the person, but there's nothing wrong with any of that. So two more things really quick. Where should we stop here? Okay, so how long did it take God to make everything? Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. It took God 7 days 6 days and the seventh day to rest. And obviously that's when our Sabbath rest is. If God's going to rest on this day from all of his labors, then why do we not rest on that same day in honor of what God has done? God, it was a reflection. God rested on what he had done, and it's symbolic of us going to heaven and resting after all of the work that we do here, our plowing, our creating, our plants, our things which are the Christians that we're trying to disciple and grow and teach and tell people about Jesus. At the very end of all of our labors here on earth against the Antichrist and people who hate Christianity and maybe us getting killed for the faith, after all of that, we're going to have obviously a Sabbath rest that's never going to end, and that's the day of rest that we're going to have. But that's what it's symbolic of right here, where God rested from his labors. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to rest together with God and essentially have a vacation with God the whole time. worshiping and loving and praising and being with God the whole time and enjoying ourselves without sin, without hating each other, without all of that. So it's going to be an awesome time, and who knows what God's going to do next after this. There's got to be something that God's going to do next that's going to make people, you know, who knows what God's going to create after this that we're going to be able to help God in. So I think I'm going to cut it off right there. Got lots more to go, but I can't do everything today. So anybody got any questions or any kind of comments or anything that you guys would like to learn? I appreciate the hearts there. Or we can move on. The next things we're going to go into after this, the creation of everything, we're going to go into where Satan was created, what was Satan before he fell, what he did for a sin, that kind of stuff. So I don't want to make the video too long because obviously people don't watch long videos. But I appreciate it. This video will be up, will stay up online for another 24 hours. And then I will try to record it and send it to YouTube if I'm able to. If not, then I will. You're welcome, Vanessa, by the way. So I'll try to do this again tomorrow at 9:30 and see if we can get anything going. And invite your friends, invite whoever, so that we can get together and study. So we're going to talking about Satan and where he came from and where he fell and where the Bible shows all that, and help you to understand who he is and then the fall of man. So all we've got covered so far is just the creation, and then we'll move on from there. So tomorrow, 9:30. If you guys got friends, invite who you can. Use your Twitter and all that stuff. And I will see you guys tomorrow. Hopefully you guys had a great time.